Mi nombre es Gilberto y soy del Gurquerque, Nuevo México. Siempre supe la importancia que es un seguro médico, pero nunca...
New purpose in life. With the help of Be Well, New Mexico's health insurance marketplace.
I've been to just about every continent on the planet, with the exception of somewhere like Antarctica.
He married an Ipswich girl, 50,
Followed by the deliberate burning and dynamite. The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. Read by Mike Bennett. Chapter 1. During the winter of 19...
The men of Gondor, led by Faramir, brother of Boromir. Faramir discovered the nature of their quest, but resisted the temptation to which Boromir had succumbed, and sent them forward on the...
My jewels are at your disposal, Perrin, Berelain put in, her voice steady and her face firm. If necessary, Grady O'Neill can fetch more from Mayen. Gold as well. Ryan cleared his throat. Altarans are used to marauders, milady. Neighboring nobles and brigands alike, he said slowly, slapping his reins against his palm. Although reluctant to contradict Berlane, he clearly intended to anyway. There's no law this far from Abu Dar except what the local lord or lady says. Noble or common, they're accustomed to paying off anyone they can't fight off, and quick to tell the difference. It goes against reason that none of them tried to buy safety, yet we've seen nothing but ruins in these Shido's path, heard of nothing but pillage right down to the ground. They may accept an offer of ransom, and even take it, but can they be trusted to give anything in return? Just making the offer gives away our one real advantage, that they don't know we're here. Anura shook her head slightly, the barest movement, but Galen's one eye caught it and he frowned. You disagree, Anura, said I? He asked politely, and with a hint of surprise. The Grey was almost diffident at times, especially for her sister, but she never vacillated about speaking up when she disagreed with advice offered to Berlane. This time Anura hesitated, though, and covered by pulling her cloak around herself and arranging the folds with care. It was clumsy of her. Aes Sedai could ignore heat or cold when they chose, remaining untouched when everyone around them was drenched with sweat or fighting to stop their teeth chattering. An Aes Sedai who paid attention to the temperature was buying time to think, usually about how to hide what she was thinking. Glancing toward Marlene with a small frown, she finally reached a decision, and the slight crease in her forehead vanished. Negotiation is always better than fighting, she said in cool Tarabana accent. And in negotiation, trust is always a matter of the precautions, yes? We must consider with care the precautions that must be taken. There is also the question of who is to approach them. Wise ones may no longer be sacrosanct, since they took part in the battle at Dumai's Wells. A sister, or a group of sisters, might be better, yet even that must have careful arrangement. I myself am willing to... No ransom, Baron said, and when everyone stared at him, most in consternation, Anura with her face unreadable, he said it again in a harder voice. No ransom. He would not pay these Shido for making Fail suffer. She would be afraid, and they had to pay for that, not profit from it. Besides, Galen had the right of it. Nothing Perrin had seen in Altara or Amadisia, or before that in Cairhien, so much as hinted that the Shadow could be trusted to keep any bargain. As well trust rats in the grain bins and cutworms with the harvest. Elias, I want to see their camp. When he was a boy, he had known a blind man, Nat Torfin, with his wrinkled face and thin white hair, who could disassemble any blacksmith's puzzle by touch. For years, Perrin tried to learn how to duplicate that feat, but he never could. He had to see how the pieces fit together before he could make sense of them. Aram, find Grady and tell him to meet me as fast as he can at the traveling ground. That was what they had come to call the place where they arrived at the end of each jump and departed from for the next. It was easier for the Ashaman to weave a gateway in a place already touched by one they had woven before. Aram gave one short, purposeful nod, then wheeled his gray and sped toward camp. But Perrin could see arguments and questions and demands gathering on the faces around him. Marlene was still examining him, as though suddenly not quite sure what he was. Galen was frowning at the reins in his hands, no doubt seeing matters turn out badly whatever he did. But Berlaine wore a perturbed expression, objections visible in her eyes, and Enora's mouth had tightened to a thin line. Aes Sedai disliked being interrupted, and diffident for an Aes Sedai or not, she looked ready to vent her displeasure. Arganda, his face growing red, opened his mouth with the clear intention of shouting. Arganda had shouted often since his queen was kidnapped. There was no point in waiting to listen. Digging in his heels, Perrin sent Stepper lunging through the line of winged guards, heading back toward the sheared trees. Not at a run, but not dawdling either. A quick trot through the towering forests, hands tight on the reins and eyes already searching the dappled face of Grady. Elias followed on his gelding without a word. Perrin had been sure he had no room in him for another ounce of fear, yet Elias's silence made the weight grow. The other man never saw an obstacle without seeing a way around. His silence shouted of impassable mountains. There had to be a way, though. When they reached the smooth stone outcrop, Perrin walked Stepper back and forth through the slanting bars of light, around the toppled trees and between the standing ones, unable to make himself stop. He had to keep moving. There had to be a way. His mind darted like a caged rat. Elias dismounted to squat and frown at the sliced stone, paying little heed to his gelding tugging at the reins and trying to back away. Beside the stone, the thick trunk of a pine that had stood a good 50 paces tall was propped up at one end by the splintered remains of its stump, high enough that Elias could have walked beneath the tree trunk upright. Brilliant rays of sunlight piercing the forest canopy elsewhere seemed to deepen the shadow to near blackness around the track-marked outcrop, but that troubled him no more than it did Perrin. His nose wrinkled at the burnt sulfur smell that still hung in the air.
I thought I caught this stink on the way here. I expect you'd have mentioned this if you didn't have things on your mind. A big pack. Bigger than anything I've ever seen or heard of.
That's what Masuri said, Perrin said absently. What was keeping Grady? How many people were there in Ebudar? That was the size of the Shaido camp. She said she's crossed the paths of 7 packs, and this isn't one she's seen before.
7?
Elias murmured in surprise.
Even an Aes Sedai would have to go some to do that. Most tales of dark hounds are just people frightened by the dark.
Frowning at the tracks crossing the smooth stone, he shook his head, and sadness entered his voice when he said,
They were wolves once. The souls of wolves, anyway. Caught and twisted by the Shadow. That was the core used to make dark hounds. The Shadow Brothers. I think that's why the wolves have to be at the last battle. Or maybe dark hounds were made because wolves will be there to fight them. The pattern makes Silvara lace look like a piece of string sometimes. Anyway, it was a long time ago, during the Trolloc Wars, as near as I can make out, and the War of the Shadow before that. Wolves have long memories. What a wolf knows is never really forgotten while other wolves remain alive. They avoid talking about darkhounds, though, and they avoid darkhounds, too. 100 wolves could die trying to kill one Shadow Brother. Worse, if they fail, the Darkhound can eat the souls of those that aren't quite dead yet. And in a year or so, there'd be a new pack of Shadow Brothers that didn't remember ever being wolves. I hope they don't remember anyway. Perrin reined in, though he itched to keep moving. Shadow Brothers.
The wolves' name for darkhounds had taken on a new grimness. Can they eat a man's soul, Elias? Say a man who can talk to wolves? Elias shrugged. Only a handful of people could do what they did, as far as either man knew. An answer to that question might come only at the point of death. More importantly, right then, if they had been wolves once, they must be intelligent enough to report what they found. Masuri had implied as much. Foolishness to hope otherwise.
Hey, Grandpa, how you doing?
How long did he have to free Fail? The sound of hooves crunching in snow announced riders coming, and he hurriedly told Elias that the Darkhounds had circled the camp, that they would be carrying word of him to whomever they reported to. I wouldn't worry over much, boy, the older man replied, watching warily for sight of the oncoming horses. Moving away from the stone, he began to stretch, working muscles overlong in the saddle. Elias was too careful to be caught.
I'm not doing too bad. I can't complain too much.
It's like they're hunting something more important than you. They'll stay on that till they find it, if it takes all year.
How you doing, Grandpa?
Don't worry. We'll get your wife out before those Darkhounds.
How's the weather?
Not saying it'll be easy, but we'll do it. There was determination in his voice and in his scent, but not much hope. Almost none at all, in fact. Despair, refusing to let it rise again, Perrin resumed walking stepper as Berelain and her bodyguard appeared through the trees, with Marlene astride behind Anura. As soon as the Aes Sedai drew rein, the twilight-eyed wise one slid to the ground, shaking down her thick skirts to cover
43.
the stockings.
For us, it's,
Another woman
let's
might have
see.
appeared flustered over having her legs exposed, but not Marlene. She was merely straightening her clothes. Anura was the one who looked upset, a sour-faced disgruntlement that made her nose seem more like a beak.
It's,
She kept silent.
29 out there right now.
She
And,
must have been certain her offer to negotiate
somewhat
this
snowing.
would be accepted, especially with Berelain supporting, and Marlene seemingly neutral at worst. Greys were negotiators and mediators, adjudicators and treaty makers. That might have been her motivation. What else could it have been? A problem that he had to set aside while
when I get money,
he had to take into account
I gotta
might interfere with
get a
Fael.
whole new
The problem he had to
appointment
solve lay 40 miles to the northeast.
because my
While the
script's
winged
already
guards formed a
expired.
protective circle among the towering trees around
Then
the
I
battlefield
gotta
ground, Berelain brought her bay alongside
get the
so they
glasses.
faced him, trying to
Well, there's a
inspire her.
website I go to that I could get my glasses for pretty
She smelled
decent
uncertain,
price.
doubtful of his
I
decision.
just gotta get the
Maybe she hoped
appointment
to
done.
attempting the ransom. He kept a stepper moving and refused to listen. To make that
Yeah, that
attempt was
part
to gamble
sucks.
everything on one toss of the dice. He could not gamble with Fael as the stake. Methodical as working at a forge, that was the way. Light, but he was tired. He folded himself in tighter around his anger, embracing the heat for energy. Galen and Arganda arrived shortly after Berelain, with a double column of Gildanan lancers in burnished breastplates and bright conical helmets who interspersed themselves among the Mayenners between the trees. A trace of irritation entering her scent.
But I don't know. Something eventually happened, hopefully.
The pair of them sat their horses knee to knee, the one-eyed man bending his head to listen to what Berelain had to say. Her voice was low, but Perrin knew their subject, at least in part. Now and then one of them glanced at him as he walked a step
Are
back
you?
and forth,
Nice.
back and forth. Arganda planted his run in one spot and stared south through the trees toward the camp. Still as a statue, yet radiating impatience as a fire radiated heat. He was the picture of a soldier, with his plumes and his sword and his silvered armor.
Don't
His
know
face
like
was hard
that.
to still, but he smelled on the brink of panic. Perrin wondered how he himself smelled.
This weather is,
You could never catch your own scent unless you
it
were
makes my
close to
back
his
hurt
face.
really bad.
He did not think he smelled of panic, just fear and anger. All would be well once he had Fael back. All would be well then. Back and forth, back and forth. At last Aram appeared, with a yawning Jergrady and a dark bay gelding, dark enough that the white stripe on its nose made it seem almost a black. Daniel and a dozen Two Rivers men, spears and halberds abandoned for the
Nice.
moment in favor of their longbows, rode close behind, but not too close. A stocky fellow with a weathered face already beginning to show creases, though he was short of his middle years yet. Grady looked like a sleepy farmer, despite the long-hilted sword at his waist and his black coat with the silver sword pin and the high collar. But he had left the farm behind forever, and Daniel and the others always gave him room. They gave Perrin room too, hanging back and peering at the ground, sometimes darting quick, embarrassed looks at him or Barrowman. It did not matter. All would be well. Tried to lead Grady to Perrin, but the Ashaman knew why he had been summoned. Aside, he climbed down beside Elias, who squatted in a patch of sunlight to mark a map in the snow with his finger, and speak of distance and direction, describing the place he wanted to go in detail, a clearing on a slope that faced almost south.
Oh yeah,
notched in 3
Grandpa,
places.
appreciate it.
Distance
Hope
and
you have a
direction
good
were
rest of
enough,
your
but the distance and
night.
direction were precise. But the better the picture in an Ashaman's mind, the closer he could come to an exact spot. No margin for error here, boy. Elias's eyes seemed to brighten with intensity. Whatever others thought of Ashaman, they never intimidated him. There's lots of ridges in that country. The main camp is only a mile or so the other side of this one.
Not sure how long the stream will be.
Little parties that camp in a different place every night, maybe less than 2 miles the other way. If you put us off by much, we'll be seen for sure. Grady met that stare, unblinking. Then he nodded and scrubbed his stubby fingers through his hair, drawing a deep breath. He looked as weary as Elias, as bone-tired as Perrin felt. Making gateways, holding them open long enough for thousands of people and horses to pass through was wearing work. Are you rested enough? Perrin asked him. Tired men made mistakes, and mistakes with the one power could be deadly. Should I send for Niald? Grady stared up at him blearily, then shook his head. Pager's no more rested than me. Less, maybe. I'm stronger than he is, a bit. Better if I do it. He turned to face northeast, and with no more warning, a vertical slash of silver blue appeared beside the track-marked stone. Anura jerked her mare out of the way with a loud gasp as the line of light widened into an opening, a hole in the air that showed a sunlit clearing on steep ground among trees much smaller than those around Perrin and the others. The already splintered pine shivered as it lost another thin slice, groaned, and collapsed the rest of the way with a snow-muffled crash that made the horses snort and dance. Anura glared at the Ashaman, her face growing dark, but Grady just blinked and said, Does that look like the right place? Elias adjusted his hat before nodding. That nod was all Perrin waited for. He ducked his head and rode Stepper through the snow that was over the Don Svetlocks. It was a small clearing, but the sky full of white clouds overhead made it seem vastly open after the forest behind. The light was almost blinding compared to the forest, though the sun was still hidden by the tree-covered ridge above. The Shido camp lay on the other side of that ridge. He stared toward the height yearningly. It was all he could do to stay where he was, rather than race ahead to finally see where Fail was. He made himself turn Stepper to face the gateway as Marlene came out. Still studying him, hardly taking her eyes away long enough to place her feet in the snow without tripping, she moved to one side to let Aram and the 2 Rivers men ride through. Accustomed to traveling, if not to Ashaman by now, they barely bent their heads enough to clear the top of the opening, and only the tallest did even that. It struck Perrin that the gateway was larger than the first one of Grady's make that he had passed through. He'd had to dismount then. It was a vague thought, no more important than a fly buzzing. Aram rode straight to Perrin, tight-faced and smelling impatient and eager to be going on. And once Daniel and the others were out of the way, climbing down and contemplating arrows to bows while they watched the surrounding trees, Belen appeared, peering grimly at the trees around them as though he expected an enemy to come dashing out, followed by half a dozen Mayenners, who had to lower their red-streamered lances to crowd through after him. A long pause passed with the gateway empty, but just when Perrin had decided to go back and see what was holding Elias up, the bearded man led his horse out, with Arganda and 6 Gildanon riding at his heels, discontent carved on their faces. Their shining helmets and breastplates were nowhere to be seen, and they scowled as though they had been made to leave off their breeches. Perrin nodded to himself. Of course. The Shido camp was on the other side of this ridge, and so was the sun. That gleaming armor would have been like mirrors. He should have thought of that. He was still letting fear goad him into impatience and clouded thinking. He had to be clear-headed, now more than ever. The detail he missed now could kill him and leave Fail in Shido hands. It was easier to say that he had to let go of fear than to do it, though. How could he not be afraid for Fail? It had to be managed, but how? Prize and Nora rode through the gateway just ahead of Grady, who was leading his dark bay. Just as every time he had seen her pass through a gateway, she lay as flat on her mare as her saddle's high pommel would allow, grimacing at the opening that had been made with the tainted male half of the power, and as soon as she was clear of it, she urged her horse as far up the slope as she could without entering the trees. Grady let the gateway snap shut, leaving the purple after-image of a vertical bar in Perrin's eyes, and Nora flinched and looked away, glaring at Marlene, at Perrin. If she had been anyone other than an Aes Sedai, he would have said she was simmering in a sullen fury. Berelain must have told her to come, but it was not Berelain she blamed for having to be there. "From here, we go afoot," Elias announced in a quiet voice that barely carried over the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. He had said the Shaido were careless and had no sentries, or almost none, but he spoke as if they could be within 20 paces. "A man on a horse stands out. The Shaido aren't blind, just blind for Aiel, which means they see twice as sharp as any of you. So don't go skylining yourselves when we reach the crest. And try not to make any more noise than you can help. They aren't deaf either. They'll find our tracks eventually. Can't do much about that in snow. But we can't let them know we were here until after we're gone." Tower, over being shorn of his armor and plumes, Arganda began to argue about Elias giving orders. Not being a complete fool, he did it in a quiet voice that would not carry. But he had been a soldier since the age of 15. He had commanded soldiers fighting Whitecloaks, Altarans, and Almedicians. And as he was fond of pointing out, he had fought in the Aiel War and lived through the blood snow at Tarvalon. He knew about Aiel, and he did not need an unbarbered woodsman to tell him how to put his boots on. Perrin let it pass, since the man did his complaining in between telling off 2 men to hold the horses. He really was not a fool, just afraid for his queen. Galen left all of his men behind, muttering that lancers were worse than useless off their horses, and would probably break their necks if he made them walk any distance. He was no fool either, but he did see the black side first. Elias took the lead, and Perrin waited only long enough to transfer the thick, brass-bound tube of his looking-glass from Stepper's saddlebags to his coat pocket before following. The underbrush grew in clumps beneath the trees, which were mostly pine and fir, with clusters of others that were winter-gray and leafless, and the terrain no steeper than the sandhills back home, if more rocky, presented no problems for Daniel and the other 2 Rivers men, who ghosted up the slope with arrows nocked and eyes watchful, almost as silent as the mist of their breath. Aram, no stranger to the woods himself, stayed close to Perrin with his sword out. Once he started to chop a tangle of thick brown vines out of his way until Perrin stopped him with a hand on his arm. Yet he made little more noise than Perrin, the faint crunch of boots in snow. It was no shock that Marlene moved through the trees as if she had grown up in a forest instead of the Aiel waste, where anything that could be called a tree was rare and snow unheard of, though it seemed that all of her necklaces and bracelets should have made some clatter as they swung. But Anura climbed with almost as little effort, floundering a little with her skirts, but deftly avoiding the sharp thorns of dead cat's claw and wait-a-minute vines. Aes Sedai usually found a way to surprise you. She managed to keep a wary eye on Grady, too, though the Ashaman appeared to be focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Sometimes he sighed heavily and paused for a minute, frowning toward the crest ahead, but somehow he never fell behind. Galen and Arganda were not young men, nor accustomed to walking where they could ride, and their breathing began to grow heavier as they ascended, sometimes pulling themselves up from tree to tree. But they watched one another nearly as much as they did the ground, each unwilling to let the other outdo him. The 4 Gildan lancers, on the other hand, slipped and slid, tripped over roots hidden beneath the snow, caught their scabbards on vines, and growled curses when they fell on rocks or were stabbed by thorns. Perrin began to consider sending them back to wait with the horses. That, or hitting them over the head and leaving them to be picked up when he returned. The 2 Aiel stepped out of the undergrowth in front of Elias, dark veils hiding their faces to the eyes, white cloaks hanging down their backs, and spears and bucklers in hand. They were maidens of the spear by their height, which made them no less dangerous than any other Algaid Siswai, and in an instant 9 longbows were drawn, broadhead points aimed at their hearts. "You could get hurt that way, Tuanda," Elias muttered. "You should know better, Sulin." Perrin motioned for the 2 Rivers men to lower their bows, and for Aram to lower his sword. He had caught their scents as soon as Elias had, before they stepped into the open. The maidens exchanged startled looks, but they unveiled, letting the dark veils hang down their chests. "You see closely, Elias Machera," Sulin said. Wiry and leather-faced, with a scar across one cheek, she had sharp blue eyes that could pierce like balls, but they still looked surprised now. Tuanda was taller and younger, and she might have been pretty before losing her right eye and gaining a thick scar that ran from her chin up under her shufa. It pulled up one corner of her mouth in a half-smile, but that was the only smile she ever gave. "Your coats are different," Baron said. Tuanda frowned down, gray and green and brown, then at Sulan's identical garment. "Your cloaks, too." Elias was tired to make that slip. "They haven't started moving, have they?" "No, Baron Ibarra," Sulan said. "The Shido seemed prepared to stay in one place for a time. They made the people from the city leave and go north last night. Those they would let leave." She gave a small shake of her head, still perturbed by the Shido forcing people to become Gaishain who did not follow Giotto. "Your friends, Jundin Baron and Get Elia and Hugh Marwin, have gone after them to see if they can learn anything. Our spear sisters in Gaul are making their way around the camp again. We waited here for Elias Machera to return with you." She seldom let emotion into her voice, and there was none there now, but she smelled of sadness. "Come, I will show you." Maidens turned up the slope, and he hurried after them, forgetting anyone else. A little short of the crest, they crouched, then went to hands and knees, and he copied them, rolling the last spans through the snow to peer past a tree over the top of the ridgeline. The forest ended there, fading into scattered brush and isolated saplings on the downslope. He was high enough to see for several leagues, across rolling ridges like long treeless hills, to where a dark band of forest began again. He could see everything he wanted to see, and so much less than he needed. He had tried to imagine the Shido camp from Elias's description, but the reality dwarfed his imaginings. 1,000 paces below lay a mass of low Aiel tents and every other sort of tent, a mass of wagons and carts and people and horses. It spread for well over a mile in every direction from the gray stone walls of a city halfway to the next rise. He knew the squall must be the same on the other side. It was not one of the great cities, not like Camelin or Tarvalin. Less than 400 paces wide along the side he could see, and narrower on the others, it seemed. But still a city with high walls and towers, and what looked like a fortress at the northmost end. Yet the Shido encampment swallowed it whole. Aiel was somewhere in that great lake of people. His looking glass from his pocket, remembered at the last instant to cup one hand for shade down the far end of the tube. The sun was a golden ball almost ahead of him, just shy of halfway to its noonday height. A stray reflection from the lens could ruin everything. Groups of people leapt up in the looking glass, their faces clear, at least to his eye. Long-haired women with dark shawls over their shoulders, draped in dozens of long necklaces. Women with fewer necklaces milking goats. Women wearing the cotton soap, sometimes carrying spears and bucklers. People from the deep columns of heavy white robes as they already trampled halfway to mud. There were many, but his eyes skipped past them hungrily. Thousands of women, just like those in white. Too many, Marlene whispered, and he lowered the glass to glare at her. The others had joined the maidens and him, all lying in a row in the snow along the ridgeline. The Two Rivers men were taking pains to keep their bowstrings up out of the snow without raising their bows above the ridgeline. Arganda and Galen were using their own looking glasses to study the camp below, and Grady was staring down the slope with his chin propped in his hands, every bit as intent as the two soldiers. Maybe he was using the power in some way. Marlene and Nura were staring at the camp too, the Aes Sedai licking her lips, the Wise One frowning. Perrin did not think Marlene had intended to speak aloud. "If you think I'll walk away just because there are more Shido than I expected," he began heatedly, but she broke in, meeting his scowl with a level look. "Too many women, Perrin Ibarra. Wherever I look, I can see a woman channeling. Here, almost there. Why all the time? But they are everywhere I look. Too many to be the wise ones of 10 septs." He drew a deep breath. "How many do you think there are?" "I think maybe all of the Shido wise ones are down there," Marlene replied, as calm as if she were talking about the price of barley. "All who can channel. All of them. That made no sense. How could they all be together here, when the shadows seemed to be scattered everywhere? At least he had heard tales of what had to be shadow raids all across Gildan and Amadisia, tales of raids here in Altara long before Fail was taken, and rumors from even farther. Why would they all be together? If the shadow intended to gather here, the whole thing. He had to deal with what he knew for fact. That was bad enough. He asked again, in a reasonable tone. Do not growl at me, Perene Bara. I cannot say exactly how many Shadow Wise Ones remain alive. Even wise ones die from sickness, snakebite, accident. Some died at Demise Wells. We found bodies left behind, and they must have carried away those they could for proper burial. Even Shido cannot have abandoned all custom. If all who remain alive are below, and the apprentices who can channel, perhaps 400, perhaps more, but fewer than 500. There were fewer than 500 Shadow Wise Ones who could channel before they crossed the Dragon Wall, and perhaps 50 apprentices. Most farmers would have shown more emotion over the barley. Still staring down at the Shadow camp, Anura made a strangled sound, half a sob. 500? Right. Half the tower from one clan? Oh, shit. Sneak in the night, Dennis heard from down the road. The way you sneaked into that White Cloak camp back home. Elias gave a grunt that might have meant anything, but did not sound hopeful. Sulan snorted derisively. We could not sneak into that camp, not with any real hope of getting out. You would be trussed like a goat for the spit before you passed the first tents. Farron nodded slowly. He had thought of slipping in under cover of darkness and somehow spiriting Fail away. And the others, of course. She would not go without the others. He had never had any real belief that could work, though. Not against Aiel, and the size of the camp had quenched the last glimmers. He could wander for days among that many people without finding her. Abruptly, he realized that he was not having to fight down despair. The anger remained, but it was cold as steel in winter now. And a single drop of the hopelessness that had tried to drown him before. There were 10,000 Algaid Siswai in that camp, and 500 women who could channel. Galen had the right of it. Prepare for the worst, and all your surprises were pleasant ones. 500 women, I would not hesitate to use the Fail was a snowflake in a meadow covered with snow. But when you piled up so much, there was just no point in despair. You had to buckle down or be plowed under. Besides, he could see the puzzle now. Nat Torfin had always said any puzzle could be solved, once you found out where to push and where to pull. To the north and south, the land had been cleared farther from the city than the rise where he lay. Scattered farmhouses, none with smoke rising from its chimney, dotted the landscape, and rail fences marked out fields beneath the snow.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into your stream for tonight. I would get on longer, but my back's killing me, y'all. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who keeps stopping by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Hope everyone stays safe out there and stays warm. Till next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.